This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 317 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I'm a little under the weather today, so I'm sorry if I sound a little bit like Chucky from the Rugrats. Now keep in mind, I understand that a lot of you have seen your trade deadlines pass, so you can't just buy and sell players very easily. You can also use this week's show as just gathering more information about fantasy football, but you can also think of the buys and sells as sort of confidence picks. If a player is a buy, you can feel more confident in that player moving forward, and then vice versa. Next week in the moving forward, the show's going to be geared way more towards adds and drops. But not all trade deadlines have passed, so I have one more week of heavier buys and sells. Before getting into this week's transactions, I wanted to send another reminder to you guys to check out OddsFire. It's an odds comparison that NumberFire's engineers developed, and it's the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Compare odds, quickly identify the best value, and even examine first-party FanDuel data all in one place. I use it every single week when I'm analyzing the slate of games, and I think that you guys would get a lot of use out of it too. Never settle, always get the best odds. Check out the experience for free now at NumberFire or oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Buy Saquon Barkley. The last time we saw Saquon Barkley, he had 13 carries for 1 yard. It was a generational experience. But a lot of people were wondering, are the Giants just going to shut Saquon Barkley down for the rest of the season? They're already out of it, so why throw Saquon Barkley out there? Pat Shurmur has said that's not going to happen. And that's good for fantasy football managers. Because since returning from his ankle injury, Barkley's handled about 97% of New York's running back carries, and he has an 18% target share. He's seen elite usage. And in weeks 15 and 16, the fantasy football playoffs, New York will face Miami and Washington. Both of those teams rank as top 7 opponents for opposing fantasy running backs when adjusted for strength of opponent. So Saquon Barkley could go nuts in the fantasy football playoffs. Add Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel's still available in about half of Yahoo leagues. And that needs to change. It should have changed last week before he had another big performance. But Deebo Samuel has watched his snap rate increase over the last 5 weeks. Back in week 5, his snap rate was about 40% to 50%, sort of in that range. This past Sunday, it was 79%. And that was just shy of his season high, which happened last week at 83%. Now that's naturally correlated with more volume. The more you're on the field, the higher the probability that you're going to see targets. And he's averaged about a 22% target share over his last 3 games. And since he's good at football, he's a very good wide receiver, he's now looking at back-to-back wide receiver 1 performances. So if he's on your waiver wire still, he absolutely needs to be added. Sell Mark Ingram. Players in good offenses tend to score more touchdowns than they should. A good example of this is Aaron Jones. But even still, players in good offenses can still outperform these peripheral numbers. And that's what we've seen from Mark Ingram throughout this entire season. We know that volume-related statistics correlate to fantasy success. With running backs, we're looking at rush attempts, targets, snaps played. Those are all really important numbers. But Mark Ingram doesn't have great marks within those statistical categories. He's 15th in running back rush attempts. That's fine, but it's not elite. He's 21st in running back rushing share. And among all running backs, he ranks 38th in target share. And all of this is being benefited by the fact that he hasn't missed a game. And his snap share isn't that great either. He hasn't hit a 50% snap share since week 7. And he barely ranks in the top 30 in snap rate played. But here we are in week 12, and Mark Ingram is the RB11 in PPR formats. It's because of touchdowns. He had another 2-touchdown day in week 11, and he now has 10 touchdowns on the year. But based on his yardage total, and we know that yards correlate to touchdowns, but based on that total, he should have 4.6 fewer touchdowns than he actually has. Even if you cut that number in half because of the offense that he's in, it's hard to sell Mark Ingram as anything but a negative touchdown regression candidate. So he should slow down as we move through the rest of the season. He's still a start-worthy fantasy asset. I think he's just more of an RB2 rather than the RB1 that he's played as throughout the season. Add Bo Scarborough. So Bo Scarborough ended up leading the Lions' backfield in Week 11. He played 49% of the team's snaps. That was 20% higher than any other Detroit running backs. That includes Ty Johnson. And that allowed Scarborough to see about 74% of the team's running back rushes, which was a share that hadn't been hit since Kerryon Johnson was active. Scarborough likely won't be involved that much in the passing game. That's the downside here. J.D. McKissic and Ty Johnson are both capable pass catchers. But Scarborough could easily lead the team in early down work, and he's likely to be the goal line guy moving forward. So there's some value there. Hold Jameis Winston. When you watch Jameis Winston play football, you cringe. And if you have Jameis Winston on your fantasy team, you cringe even more. It's hard to watch Jameis Winston sometimes. But even with his 4 interceptions on Sunday, he still scored almost 15 standard fantasy points. He was still a rock-solid QB too. And really, since week 2, he's been really good. He's averaging 19.6 fantasy points per game, and he hasn't had fewer than 12 fantasy points in a single contest. Like I said, it's tough to watch Jameis Winston, but this is a great example of how fantasy football doesn't always equate to reality. It's why it's fantasy football. We can't let that overshadow the type of value that Jameis Winston is in fantasy football. And that's especially true because Tampa Bay has some good matchups to close out the season. And that includes 2 games in Week 15 and 16, the fantasy football playoffs, against Detroit and Houston. Those are 2 of the top 8 most favorable matchups for opposing quarterbacks when adjusted for strength of opponent. Sell Josh Allen. So similar to Jameis Winston, you can make the case that watching Josh Allen is not the prettiest thing in the world. But he gets it done in fantasy football, mostly because of what he can do with his legs. He's averaging 33 rushing yards per game and 0.7 rushing touchdowns per game. But you guys might remember, but all the way back in Week 6, I was talking about this Bills passing attack being a buy candidate because the upcoming schedule was amazing. From then until now, they've faced Miami, Philadelphia, Washington, Cleveland, and then Miami again. Each of those teams were top half of the league matchups for opposing quarterbacks when adjusted for strength of schedule heading into Week 11. But things get pretty rough for the Bills moving forward. They get Denver this week, who has held opposing quarterbacks to 4.3 fewer points per game compared to their season-long averages. And then they get Dallas, who have allowed 1.9 fewer points, then Baltimore, 3.5 fewer points, then Pittsburgh, 2.5 fewer points, and then New England, 7.2 fewer points. It's the toughest stretch that you can find for a quarterback across the NFL. I do think that Josh Allen can be fine given his rushing floor, but don't expect him to perform as he has over the last 5 or so weeks. Add Nyheim Hines, Jonathan Williams, and Jordan Wilkins. This might be the longest transaction in 15 transactions history, but Marlon Mack fractured his hand on Sunday, and now he's out indefinitely. That means you've got to add someone in this Colts backfield. It's just really hard to predict who you should add, so let's just talk this out. I think that Nyheim Hines is the safest player to get in PPR formats because we know he's a great pass-catching back. We know he's going to have some sort of role in this offense. But then he has the upside of potentially seeing a little bit more early down work. Keep in mind, without Marlon Mack for 4 games last year, Nyheim Hines actually carried 43% of the Colts' running back rushes. On Sunday, after Marlon Mack was hurt, Mack's running back rush share was 23%. Now, that's not very high, but going into this week, it was under 10%. So there should be some boost for Nyheim Hines on the ground. And then there's Jonathan Williams and Jordan Wilkins. Williams saw 43% of the Colts' backfield touches in Week 11, but Wilkins was also inactive due to an ankle injury. Jordan Wilkins has been the number 3 option for Indianapolis this year. Really, he's been the handcuff for Marlon Mack, the hypothetical handcuff. So I think we should expect a healthy Jordan Wilkins to see the most early down work. But here's the thing. Reports are saying right now that Jordan Wilkins should be healthy for Thursday night's game, but we don't know for sure. And then on top of that, what if Jonathan Williams just played into more work? Because he looked good on Sunday, and he ran for 116 yards on just 13 carries. So it's a messy situation. But like I said, in PPR formats, I would be prioritizing Nyheim Hines because I do think he has a nice floor-ceiling combo, and then I would spend a little bit less and take a shot on Williams or Wilkins. Sell Kalen Ballage. This is one of the easiest sells of all time because Kalen Ballage has been pathetic running the football this year. And I rarely say words like pathetic, like this guy has been that bad. But he's been that bad. His peripheral numbers are completely fine. Over the last 2 weeks, he's seen a 76% and an 82% snap share. And he's seen 86% of the team's running back rushes and 13% of the team's targets. Those are really good numbers. Those are great peripheral numbers. But right now, as it stands, Ballage is pacing to be the first running back in NFL history to have 60 or more rushes while having a yards per carry rate below 2. That's how bad Kalen Ballage has been. And not only that, even with this usage over the last 2 weeks without both Kenyon Drake and Mark Walton, it's not like Kalen Ballage has been super fantasy relevant. And that includes a touchdown this past week. He's still averaging just 10.6 PPR points per game. I just would worry moving forward that they get some of these other running backs involved in that offense. Buy Odell Beckham. So last week I talked about Odell Beckham as being a buy or a hold, but one of his 2 games against Pittsburgh is now in the rear view. So now he's a little bit more of a buy. And if you saw Thursday night's game, then you watched OBJ barely miss a touchdown. He was down on the inch-yard line. Now, the rest of his game wasn't anything special, but he still saw 10 targets. He accounted for 34% of Cleveland's targets. He now has over a 27% target share on the season. I'll buy that all day long for a talented wide receiver. And the Browns are about to hit the softest stretch of their schedule. They get a plus matchup against Miami this week, and then in 2 of their next 3 after that, they get Cincinnati and Arizona. So I think Beckham's high target share should allow him to be competitive in those matchups. Add Dallas Goedert. I know, I promised that I wouldn't talk about Dallas Goedert anymore, but his rostered rate on Yahoo is not getting any higher. It's still only at 19%. There are 23 tight ends that are rostered at a higher rate, but since week 6, only 11 tight ends have averaged more PPR points per game than Dallas Goedert. And if you only look at tight ends who have played 4 or more games during that stretch, Goddard's a top 10 tight end. He's now seen at least 10% of Philadelphia's targets in every game played since week 4, and his snap rate hit a season high in week 11 at 81.3%. With all the injuries to Eagles wide receivers, Goddard's become a weekly option at a really pitiful position. He should be rostered in well over half of leagues now. Please add him. I'm tilting. Sell Tariq Cohen. Sunday night marked Tariq Cohen's best fantasy performance of the season. It was actually the first time that he hit 15 PPR points in a single game. He played about 60% of the team's snaps, which was his highest rate since week 1. And his 39.1% running back rush share was the second highest that it's been all season. Maybe you're thinking this is a sign of things to come, but I think there are plenty of reasons to want to move on from Tariq Cohen and not have to rely on him moving forward. Remember, David Montgomery was banged up in week 11. He failed to reach a 50% snap share for the first time since week 7. So you would think as David Montgomery heals, that number is only going to rise. And Tariq Cohen's now scored in back-to-back games as a receiver. That's despite the fact that he only has 58 receiving yards in those contests. Now, over the last 5 seasons, running backs have typically scored through the air on every 203 receiving yards, meaning Tariq Cohen is overperforming there, and that's in a bad offense. So this is not a time to buy Tariq Cohen. The offense is struggling, and he's unlikely to keep up this current pace. Buy the Baltimore Ravens defense. So there's a mailbag episode a couple of weeks ago where I talked about the Ravens defense having a very favorable schedule during the fantasy football playoffs. And since then, the Ravens defense itself has continued to dominate. It started a trend. Since they got Marcus Peters, they've played 4 games. In those games, they're averaging 17.5 fantasy points per game. They haven't finished outside the top 5 in weekly scoring with Marcus Peters. Before Peters, they were averaging 4.3 fantasy points per game. And then again, look at the fantasy football playoffs. They get the Bills, the Jets, and the Browns in weeks 14 through 16. I think Baltimore is going to be the defense that helps people win leagues. Add Sam Darnold. It's been 2 straight good games for Sam Darnold, so we can finally have a little bit more confidence playing him. And he gets another beatable defense in week 12, making him a good streaming choice. The Jets are hosting the Raiders, and they're 3.5-point home underdogs. Quarterbacks against Oakland have found success this year. They've averaged over 20 points per game against the Raiders when those same quarterbacks have averaged about 17 points per game throughout the rest of the season. So in other words, quarterbacks against the Raiders have seen a bump of more than 3 fantasy points per game this year, which is one of the bigger markups in the league. So I think Sam Darnold is fine as a streaming option in week 12. Add Ryan Griffin. Sam Darnold's teammate, Ryan Griffin, isn't that bad of a tight end streamer. He had a great week 11. He had 17.9% of the Jets' targets, and he ended up with 109 receiving yards and a touchdown. He's now seen 14% or more of New York's targets in 3 of his last 4 games. And it's really not that fluky, because over this time, he ranks 9th among all tight ends and routes run according to Pro Football Focus. So given that matchup that I just talked about against the Raiders, I think Ryan Griffin is not a bad tight end streamer. Add the Detroit Lions defense. The Lions get Washington this week. And even though they're not playing in Detroit, they're playing on the road, it's still a good matchup. Because Dwayne Haskins has not been very good. In his 2 starts, he's taken 10 total sacks and he's fumbled twice. Washington quarterbacks have now been sacked at the 4th highest rate in football. And that should help a team like Detroit because they rank 7th worst in pressure rate. According to FanDuel Sportsbook, the game has a pretty low 41.5 point over-under, so I do think that Detroit should give you some sort of a floor this week. They won't sink your team. Now, the 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add David Njoku. I don't think this is necessarily a priority add because he's still not activated at the time of this recording, and he's not listed as day-to-day. So apparently he's still not fully healthy. And we might not feel confident just throwing him into our lineups right away. But if you can stash a tight end, and if you need a tight end, he's not a bad add for similar reasons that I talked through with OBJ. The Browns have some plus matchups. And one of those matchups is against the Cardinals in Week 15. And we know how bad Arizona's been against tight ends this year. So Njoku's a deeper add, but he's one who could help you in the fantasy football playoffs. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Be in your ears tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.